Well, welcome to the second session of our RELEARN event. It's Wellbeing at the Heart of Learning. This is our attempt to sort of straddle multiple time zones today. So this is the second version of this, and it's fantastic to have Dr. Helen Griffith and Danish Karani live. Sol has been with us for both sessions as well. Now, for me in Sydney, it's actually 2 a.m. And the time zones, I think it's sort of later evening in India. It's early evening in or dinner time around Central Europe. It's midday in Central the US, and it's also early morning for San Diego. So we've managed to straddle the entire globe. And I guess from our perspective, it's been great to be able to do the series and to do it the way that we have, with some pre-recorded interviews, which enabled us to do the other session as well, and to try and gain that global perspective as well. The conversations that we're going to have we know are very important ones. There's messages from all around the world are sort of emerging from conversations, whether they're coming from parent groups or whether they're coming from teachers and schools, which are all recognizing that well-being, wellness, the need to thrive are key issues that are emerging. Now, we also know that these issues have been around for a long time, and that issues of mental health and anxiety have been growing in their significance, and also the number of students in a community over the last decade. Some would say that may be connected to mobile devices. Others would say it's connected to a different, I guess, changing society. But 2020 has been a year when those things have, I guess, reached a point where we know that with the pandemic, that we have to do something, and something that's far more significant than perhaps has been attempted in the past. So from that perspective, that's why we've gathered together some great minds and great thinkers, and to help share their thoughts. The great opportunity for people, if they wish to take it up, is that after this seminar has finished, starting in about 2 weeks' time, there's the opportunity to join a workshop group for a few weeks. Danish will be running one, Dr. Griffith will be running one, and in Australia, with Australian friendly times, Luca and I will be running one as well, so that there'll be information on that. People might also wish to contact Sol to find out more about the Learnlife work that she's been doing, and also been working very hard in the last month to get the space up and running again after a 3-month lockdown. And see, I'm sitting here in Sydney looking at all of those lovely plants, which I've had special ownership over in the past, and seeing them all there in the summer of Europe, which is lovely. All right, we're going to start off today with a conversation with Dr. Helen Griffith, first of all, and then after that we'll be switching across to one of the two interviews I've held earlier with Luca Parry in Australia, and then we'll be coming back to a conversation with Danish and Sol, looking at the issue of learning space design, and then we'll finish up with a reflective time and can take any questions and answers. And Devon, who is the leader of the Learning Guide team in Barcelona, will actually be joining us at that point as well. So that's the rough agenda, and we hope that people will find it useful from whatever angle they wish to come into the conversation. I know that on the weekend, on Sunday, I was given the opportunity to speak to a group of a few hundred principals from the Indian Principals Network, and also people from Africa and the Middle East and some European countries. And it was very interesting that without, the topic wasn't on wellbeing specifically, it was talking about leading schools back into the new normal, but wellbeing seemed to be in virtually every sentence. And I guess that for me was an indicator again that we're talking about a global issue, and we're talking about a global issue that is going to require more than just lip service to the words, but actually educators to really rethink what their perspectives are and what needs to change. So we might switch the cameras over, I guess, so that Dr. Helen Griffith and myself can hold the conversation. Now, we held the conversation beforehand that was recorded and played in the first session, but it's great to be able to do this one now live. So Dr. Griffith, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great also, as we've talked in our last few conversations via Zoom, to be able to reconnect in this way after, I guess, not having seen each other for a number of years. And I had the opportunity and the privilege of seeing the E3 Charter School in San Diego, which was a startup context as well, that Dr. Griffith was leading, and now she's involved in the Preuss School attached to the University of California as well. So we might just get you to perhaps just give a little bit of a quick rundown on your background so that people actually understand who you are and where you've come from, and then we're going to get stuck into these interesting topics.
Thank you, Stephen. It is so good to be here, sitting next to you in Zoom. I'm thankful for the technology that makes the bridge. As you said before, we've spent a lot of time together as thought partners, rethinking education, and so it's just a pleasure to continue in the work. For those of you who are meeting me for the first time today, hello. I am a native of California, and I'm a third-generation educator. I've been in San Diego most of my life. I've lived a few years in Wisconsin, but I've opened 3 schools in San Diego over the past few years, had the opportunity to redesign, redevelop, rethink. 2 of those schools were in traditional districts, the San Diego Unified School District, high school and middle school. Our middle school was what we called a STEM magnet, but I made it STEAM because I believe in the power of the arts, which I know you do as well. That's why you're on this call. But we had 6th through 8th graders who took home a device, a netbook that had 3G access. It was a blended environment back in 2007, and they could study anywhere there was cell tower access. And we extended the school day and extended the school building, and we're one of the pioneers in that work in San Diego. We saw amazing growth in our academics, but we also even saw a need then for mental health and counseling and those wellness skills that really should start developing very, very early. So we started that work even at the middle school, had the opportunity to then go and open a brand new charter high school in the public library of San Diego, a 9-story public library, $185 million building. We're couched inside the 6th and 7th floor of those 9 stories. Over 1.4 million resources available to us in the library, all of the staffing. Again, we sent home a MacBook Air with all of our scholars, which 90% of them were below the poverty level. 80% of them would be the first in their family to graduate from college. And again, we saw tremendous growth in their academics, in their civic development and engagement, career exploration, but also brought in the mental health and wellness component. By this time now, we're 10, 15 years down the road. And as Stephen said earlier, seeing a lot of challenges in mental health just by the nature of society and the things that are going on. It's a complex issue, but one that we wanted to address to make sure that we provided a service for our learners. And so here I am now at the Preuss School, UC San Diego, which is my alum. I'm glad to be back. I'm at a school now with 100% of the scholars are below the poverty level, and 100% of the scholars will be the first in their family to graduate from college. So a greater need, lot of more complex issues, but the goal is to repopulate UC San Diego with scholars that are unrepresented, the scholars of color who are not there well represented. So it's good to be home at ground zero to continue the work, to rethink the work with all of you amazing thought partners today. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Stephen, for having me. I'm excited about our time together.
Okay, well, you've touched on a number of really interesting topics already, just in introducing yourself and your background. For me, it's an interesting question because it's quite clear that wellness and learning are inseparable. But why is this something new to so many people? I mean, you've just talked about it as a natural connection in your professional life and the observation of the students that you've seen. What makes wellness and learning so inseparable, and perhaps why haven't people seen them as a connected thing in the past?
Well, one of the things that makes it inseparable is that it's inseparable. It's we're a trifold being, we're mind, body, spirit. And we don't typically think about that in education. We typically think about mind. But as we've moved on in education and we've allowed ourselves to be continual learners, to be lifelong learners, we've then refocused to what are we missing when everything seems to be going well instructionally and we're doing all that we can. We've made all the adjustments. We've brought in different instructional modalities, and why then are they still not succeeding? And then we begin to think about what is the other issue, and it's really around wellness. What are the issues that scholars are bringing to the table that we have not addressed yet? And making it more student-centered as we moved into a more student-centered educational approach, that has risen to the top. And we've had to think about these things as we want to continue to build these models of quality education where we're wrapping a 360 approach around our scholars. And typically, Stephen, it wasn't taught in our teacher training. We've never covered that. We had educational psychology, which talked about testing and assessment, but really around, the gifted learner, the disabled learner. We didn't talk about that mental health component. So now it's just a natural progression of where we've come as a society and where we've come as educators.
I mean, that's an interesting touch point as well. If you think about, we're trying to teach kids collaboration and teamwork, and yet many of the teaching force have never experienced collaboration themselves because they've been trained as solo operators. And as you've just said, they haven't been trained in emotional intelligence specifically. I mean, many teachers are obviously highly emotionally intelligent, but there hasn't been a focus on that in the training process coming through. If we think about then the preparedness of teachers to tackle what's actually going on at the moment, how do you think schools should be responding in order to have, minimal levels of capacity to tackle wellness and mental health issues?
Well, as we've had in many of our conversations, Stephen, we talked about starting at the leadership, starting with the teachers in the building. When we look at mental health preparation for clinicians, one of the first things that they do is they talk about their issues and they talk about their trauma, and they look at what they need to move into wholeness and healing, and what areas they need to begin to unpack before they begin to heal others. And so we begin to heal the healer, and we become those wounded healers because we know hurt people hurt people. So the first thing that we need to do is look at our own trauma, at our own background, what we bring to the table, and what we need to address as adults who, for the most part in our generation, have not come, especially in populations of color, who have not been, mental health and wellness has been a stigma. It's actually looked at as something that you should not focus on. I think the first thing that we need to do is get to the mindset of the adults and to allow us to become whole. And then have those conversations about, now that you feel better, how can you help your scholars? How can you help your peers? And so starting with us, we talk about teacher burnout. We talk about how the research says probably worldwide in 5 years, most teachers leave the profession because of burnout, because they aren't able to face all of the challenges that happen. And it's partially because we haven't been equipped yet. We haven't been healed and made whole in some of those areas that we're struggling in. So I think we start with ourselves. We start with the adults in the building, and then we move from there. Once we feel that fulfillment, that level of exhale, that level of wholeness and, stability, then we can then say, this is something that's valuable. It's been valuable for me. So now I must make that valuable to my scholars.
Okay, well, what does that look like? What does it look like for you to open up those topics with professionals who perhaps don't realise that they need to be working through their own hurt? What does that look like in your context when
Well,
you lead that?
Well, it can look like a lot of things. If you don't want to invest probably financially, which it will impact a school's fiscal accountability and budget. But if you want to start, it's pretty much like starting a lesson design. You know how we model a lesson in terms of a new strategy. We allow the teachers to practice it, and we put it in the adult context. And then we say, now this is something you can use in your classroom. It can be just that simple. It can be an activity around a restorative circle where we're sitting together as an adults and we're talking about, okay, how are you feeling in this pandemic? Of course, we'd be on Zoom now talking about that, but how do you feel? How are you feeling? You know, let's do a protocol about a temperature check. Give me 3 words. And someone may say frustrated, anxious, fearful, you know, and those are emotions that relate to our mental health, right? We go around the room and then we can give some strategies about how can we address, you know, Jody's fearfulness? How can we address her anxiety? And then we talk about that. And then we back up and we say, oh, by the way, we were just addressing our mental health and our wellness. So it can be something as simple as an exercise that you introduce in your professional development. And then you move on, of course, with hopefully with the goal of bringing on mental health clinicians, which is what I've created models for how schools can do that. And then financially, you can start small and then, of course, build up to the opportunities to be able to fund those. But really starting just with exercises in your professional development. The leader, of course, taking on enough information to be dangerous, as I call it, you know, reading enough information to broach the topic or bringing in other experts from the county offices of education or other schools or the mental health community to work those conversations, but starting right there.
Okay, now you can probably connect with this one, but I can think through in the last couple of decades, quite often you had this wellbeing perspective, or you had a unit in physical education, or you had a topic in English, which was to do with mental health, but it was actually ultimately they were add-ons. They weren't central. For you, what does a 360-degree approach to the whole child actually mean?
Well, the 360 approach means that you're addressing everything, all of the insecurities, you know, academic, socio-emotional, wellness, and of course, preparing them for life. It means that you address everything that the child is bringing to the table. With our population and in most populations, children are experiencing many insecurities, if it's around a food insecurity, shelter, physical insecurities, emotional insecurities, academic insecurities. Just addressing everything that they bring to the table and bringing in the community of partners who can help, but also building it into the DNA of our schools and empowering and building the capacity of the adults in the building to help address everything in that 360 approach. So that doesn't mean we become the expert of everything, but we have enough information to address it at the time and then to refer on, and as we call it, kick it upstairs or to the next level to have the other professionals who are trained in these various areas to wrap our arms around the child, which is at 360. And I like the way we say wrap our arms around, because that's like a hug, and all kids need to be loved unconditionally. So I believe in a 360 environment, you are loving the whole child and meeting all of their needs with either in the classroom or outside with a community of partners that we bring together. So no more silos in the school, Stephen, no more silos. You know, we can't do this work alone. We have to
Now,
bring in.
we're going to get onto some of those ideas that you have put into practice in terms of in-house clinicians in a moment. But before we go to there, what happens for the child who is still struggling? What's your advice to the teachers in terms of, you know, if you know that in that 360 approach, there are still issues that are there? What do you say to the teachers about what's important, and how do they shift from that social emotional care into that more academic space, and how do they know when not to shift into the academic space but to stay with the other?
So Haberman did some work around the star teacher in schools of poverty. I don't know if you're familiar with the work. Um, and it gave some tenets about teachers who had the propensity to be stellar or star, as he called it. And he actually created this interview protocol. And with in some percentage of certainty, if they passed this interview, they were, kind of guaranteed to be a good teacher. But one of the things I liked about his approach is that a star teacher never gives up. And a star teacher never assumes that they've done everything that they can do. They never assume that. And they always continue to push, to look at different ways, to look at different strategies, to bring different people into the conversation, and they never give up. So I would say to a teacher, when you're wondering, number one, never give up. But when you're wondering which space to move in and out of, consult with the partners in your community and never give up. I mean, don't take no for an answer or don't think you've done enough for an answer. Move on to the next resource. And it's something amazing that happens when you never give up. It seems like that when you keep knocking on doors, the right one will open if you never give up on children. So I would say in that space, just continue to never give up and to look for those answers that you need when you're not sure what to do. And of course, when you're sure of what to do it, but never give up.
So that concept then of never giving up, what the child brings to the table, we cannot ignore, obviously. Right. It's there and it has to be dealt with in that practical sense. Now, you have created some very, very innovative ways of broadening the number of professionals who are actually able to handle the growing issues that you're dealing with. Perhaps you could share some of those stories about how you did that and how did you grow that program?
So we started in our new school, E3 Civic High, that we created in the public library, with bringing on interns that were getting their credentialing work, either licensed social workers or professional clinical counselors or marriage and family therapists. We partnered with the University of San Diego. Nicholas Boyd, a medical clinician now with the Veterans Administration, also teaches at the University of San Diego, helped me partner this work at E3 Civic High. So we brought in the interns while they were completing their hours that they needed to complete for certification. And it's about 3,000 hours that they need to complete. So a lot of time that they need to spend on task. And they were under the supervision of licensed clinicians at the university. And the only thing we had to pay for was the supervision hours, which was about $1,600 a year, which, is minuscule in terms of a salary and benefits. So we started that work and we were able to get 2 of them on site full time. Now, of course, the environment that we were in, scholars of color with the stigma of mental health, they were like, I'm not going to see Dr. Crazy, I'm not crazy. So we had to change their mindset as well. And so we really wanted to build it into the fabric of the school. So our interns used to go into the classroom, they would sit next to our scholars, they would make them build relationships like, hey, how you doing? Hi, I'm Mr. Smith. Hi, I'm Mrs. Smith. And what are you working on? They would tutor them and talk about what they were going on in the classroom. And so after that first year, scholars not only began to refer themselves, but they began to refer others and to bring other peers. And they would address everything from grief to loss, to divorce, to domestic violence, to sexual abuse, stress and trauma, suicidal ideation, everything that they were experiencing, they were able to come and have a safe space. And then we began to train our staff. We began to incorporate it in our professional development, which we had weekly time that was set aside. So our mental health clinician would run our groups. He would bring in other teachers as experts because we all had to select a text, a research-based text. We used trauma-informed care. We used restorative practices and culturally proficient learning communities. And they would begin to teach the work together under the lead of our clinician and our staff together in those expert groups. And it became a part of our DNA. And then after a year, we were saving up and budgeting and making different adjustments to make sure that when our clinician was licensed, we'd be able to pay them a full-time salary to keep them on board. And that's how we started from the grassroots. But it was a multifaceted approach. We brought our board alongside. We used data to inform us on our decisions. We looked at the data in terms of where our starters were starting in the caseload, you know, how their attendance patterns changed, how their academics changed, how their behavior changed. And we used all that data to build that case that this was something that was significant, that was necessary, that was relevant, and that was working. And we actually started a parenting collaborative on Saturdays. So you know that when you address the child in that 360, you must bring their family along. So our mental health clinician brought in our families on Saturday. It was our AKA parenting class, but it was around areas of challenge and trauma because we wouldn't give up. When we didn't see as much progress, we go, now we need to bring the parents in and have some more training and build their capacity. And our parents actually wanted to bring in other families that were not enrolled at our school because it was being so impactful for them. So it was a grassroots approach at the ground level with minuscule financial impact, but we had a vision for where we wanted to go. And so we made it happen in that sense. And it's very doable.
Oh, I think that's what I'm hearing from you, that I guess it's the creativity of leadership that actually finds how do we bring these things in, because what you're describing is something that's actually essential going through. Now, we've almost finished our time. You know that you and I could talk forever about all of these great topics. I guess I'm going to ask you one last question. If you went into a school, how would you know if they weren't placing the wellness agenda as a pillar of their school? What would be an example? What would be symptoms of the fact that you could tell immediately that this school needs to do more?
I would first look at a scholar and I could tell if they were thriving or not by one thing: eye contact. Eye contact and engagement. So if I walked into a room and there's scholars in the room and I'm walking around, would they avoid me or would they engage me? If they would engage me, it's a sign that wellness is in the building. If they would avoid me, it's a sign that they need wellness in the building. The eyes are the windows to the soul. And I would know when I walked in the building, I could sense, are they well and are they whole, or are they on their way? And there would be, I would do some, statistical data. I would count how many. I do a percentage. I divide and multiply, and so it would be statistically correct. But seriously, it would be the windows, the eyes, the windows to their soul. Would they engage me, or would they disconnect?
Yeah, okay, very interesting. I'd love to talk more about that one, but we'll better leave it for now.
You must share.
We'll look forward to having you come back on the Q&A and reflection section at the end of this session now. But thank you so much for your insights there. A pleasure to talk again, and hopefully that sparked people to be thinking of some new areas. We're going to just now switch across to one of the recorded videos from the first session, and that was from Luca Parry in Adelaide in Australia. And Luca is presenting in two parts. The first part is actually looking at the big picture as to why we've finished up, I guess, needing to place wellbeing, wellness onto the agenda. So it's the first part, he's looking at that. The second part, he's looking more at strategies. So we will watch that short video now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Hello, everybody. It's fantastic to be here with you all to talk about something that is very close to my heart, which is well-being. And hopefully over the next 10 minutes, which is the first kind of introduction of a few of the concepts that I'll speak to, it'll also have a bit of a global understanding of why really this potentially is the moment for us to remake and reimagine what learning can be for young people, but also for all of us. Be we educators, leaders, people working outside the education ecosystem, really at all different parts. As Stephen said, here is the wonderful country of Australia. It is my home. I'm in that big purple state called South Australia right now. And as I went through school, this was what I recognized as Australia, our states and territories. And it really only took for me to be about 18 years old when I saw for the first time this map. Now, this map is also Australia, but it looks quite different because this map is a map of all of the First Nations countries that exist within Australia, an enormous diversity as you can all see there. And so I want to begin before moving on by using a beautiful protocol that we have here in Australia. It's called an acknowledgement of country. Because right now I am in southern Adelaide, which is a city, but I'm also on Ghana country. And so I'd like to attempt Ghana, which is the local language here. Ngadlu tampenti ya laka ngadlu Ghana ya tanka iparenti. Ngadlu tampenti pana ko tuila ya tanka. And that's an acknowledgement of country in Ghana, which just means I acknowledge the country that I'm on right now has been inhabited for tens of thousands of years here in Australia. And there's an enormous wisdom that comes from stopping and listening to the country, but also to Indigenous peoples all over the world. Crises disrupt, clearly, but they also reveal. And right now, I don't know about how you feel, but certainly there is this impending doom, this increased global anxiety about COVID-19 and what it actually means. And so before we do anything else, I just want you to stop for a moment, even if you're kind of walking, wherever you happen to be on our planet, and just take a deep breath in for 5 seconds and release for 5 seconds. It's amazing with everything that's happening right now, how stuck we can get into our heads and how it's really important, not least of all because we're facing a respiratory virus, but that we use our breath to be able to engage some of the powerful mindfulness and also well-being mechanisms that it enables us. Here's where I want to start. I want to zoom out to the highest level possible. And this, as you would well see, is a video. And it's the world GDP by country in billions of US dollars. And so what we're seeing here is economic growth. Now, GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. And you can see here, since 1967, which is where this particular visual starts, the world has experienced really significant economic growth. Now, by and large, that's been a very positive thing for most of the world. We have fewer people living in extreme poverty than ever before, for example. We have many countries that have been able to develop a significant middle class, that have seen entire communities lifted out of poverty. However, it's also created an enormous amount of issues as well as a byproduct of economic growth. And so one of the theses that I have that I want to pose to all of us today is, does this model still serve us? Does counting what we do and success as just growth in its kind of bluntest form in terms of GDP, is that what we want to continue to do? So when we think about the way that the world has been shifting over the last, couple of decades, with the rise of exponential technologies, with the computational era, we've seen a really significant disruption in the job landscape. We have seen a significant change. You can see the emerging roles here from some research by the World Economic Forum, the Future of Jobs report. We can see there are declining roles and there are also emerging roles. And so we are seeing really significant macro disruptions into what employment is. So those are the roles. What about the skills that underpin them? The skills that we focus on as educators through our work, but also that policymakers focus on in terms of trying to set up societies to be successful. Well, you can see the growing skills and the declining skills. Anything that is routine, be it manual or cognitive, is actually being automated by the converging technologies and the drive of the law of accelerating returns in particular. So you can get the idea of analytical thinking, active learning, creativity, critical thinking analysis, complex problem solving, emotional intelligence. These are, we know, the growing skills that from the economic standpoint of jobs, employers are actually asking for. And these are the growth areas. Here's the problem from down under here in Australia, for those of you overseas, is that even in our country, it's incredibly difficult to get into full-time employment. So at 25 years old, here in Australia, even though 2/3 of 25-year-olds hold a post-school qualification, either an apprenticeship or a university degree, 50% are not working full-time. And of course, that's only going to become more the case with the impending economic challenges that all of us are going to face globally. So that's just the economic paradigm. This graph, I think, is as important, if not more important, because the World Health Organization, which of course all of us now know about because of the global crisis, they have been showing that really, they've been predicting that the global burden of disease, the largest global burden, will actually be depression by 2030. Now, one of the concerns that I have is that because of physical distancing or social distancing, and because of the economic disruptions, we might actually get to that earlier, as we see this incredible rise in mental health and substance abuse disorders, as you can see here on this particular graph. And sadly, Australia is overrepresented in terms of the globe in that as well. So where to from here? Well, this is, I think, one of the most interesting things about the emerging economic theories that we see around the world. In my view, the old growth model is no longer fit for purpose. It's not just my view. I refer to far more qualified people like Kate Raworth, who wrote a great book called Donut Economics. We need to rethink what success is for a society. And so it's not just about growth. It's about how do we create, thriving or flourishing or well-being or wellness through every single part of our system design as societies and as education systems. So for example, this means not just measuring some of the things that are easy to measure and valuing them, but actually trying to measure the things that we value most. This is a wonderful model because it looks at overshoot and shortfall. It really tries to pick up the equity question that we have, but also the fact that we can't overshoot and that growth for the sake of growth will actually end up destroying the world at the same time. You can see climate change, air pollution, land conversion, fresh water biodiversity. There are a significant range of equal ceilings we are overshooting. So this is, I think, really important, to think about the biggest picture possible, because for our work in schools and in education systems, we need to think about what does success actually mean? What is a school for? What is a government for? What is a society for? These are the big questions we're seeing being asked all over the world. So the last thing I want to just talk about at this really high level, before we kind of look at, what are the interesting educational models that are emerging globally, is some, I think, really interesting policy work. Now, I'm a practitioner. I'm a school teacher by training. I was a school leader for a while. So policy for me, wasn't always the thing that excited me the most. But if I'm excited about any policy making right now, it is this idea of what would it look like if we had a frame for policy that focused on well-being and not on growth, not on GDP. Because even though we've got increasing GDP and we've had it for decades, we have more mental health crises, we have increasing inequality, we have all of these challenges. So how might we better focus on what success is for a country? And so I applaud the New Zealand government. And again, this is very new work. But you can see here, they are taking these particular issues and really trying to create a well society, not just a rich society in terms of GDP, but one which is well. And so how on earth would you know if your society is well? Well, we need to create new metrics and new measures. And this is the same for us in schools, which I'm sure we're going to cover quite a lot of this session, Stephen. But I wanted to start at this level. We need to change what success means, what we conceive success as. And that really is the most powerful thing we can do as leaders in societies, is to say, here's what success has been measured as. We don't think that's fit for purpose anymore. So we need a new standard, a new framework, a living standards framework, because it won't serve us if we have, enormous wealth inequality or we have ecological collapse whilst we continue on our kind of growth obsession that we have. And I'll just leave you with, before I throw it back to you, Stephen, a wonderful provocation from Sir David Attenborough. And this is a bit unfair on economists, because I know some fantastic economists. But he says, anyone that thinks you can have infinite growth in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. And so the question for us is, how might we change what success means for us as a global community, for us as a nation state, for us as a local community, for us as a learning community at a school, and ultimately for us as an individual as well. And really focus on all of those different levels for us in terms of what success, and clearly in my view, that emerging conceptualization of success is more and more about collective well-being than it is about any type of competitive or traditional metric or measure that we've inherited from the past kind of conceptualization. So there's my starting point, Stephen. I hope that's okay to start at that level.
No, that was fantastic. I think we have to start at that level because we have to get this global perspective on why we're at where we're at the moment, because then that flows all the way through. And I think that's a great question to be asking, first of all, to define success, because success as a term by itself suggests that someone wins and someone loses going through. And so that the definition and the redefinition of that is incredibly important. Okay, so that was from the earlier session, and great wisdom from Luca, and we look forward to listening to the second half of what his contributions beforehand. But we're now going to shift to a very related conversation, and that will be with Danish Karani and Sol Espoil, because we know, just from where we live, where we walk, what we enjoy, that the spaces around us have an enormous impact on our mental health and well-being. I guess hearing Luca's reference to New Zealand and my own past, having been born in New Zealand, I know that if I speak to school teachers in New Zealand and ask them what's their favourite space, almost every time I've done it, 100%, that only ever mention outdoor spaces. They never ever mention an indoor space going through. And I guess it's quite interesting because it's a national perspective. I think that New Zealanders live outdoors and New Zealanders love outdoors, and I guess it has a strong connection to the wellness agenda and the sense of well-being. So thank you to both Sol and Danish for joining us today. And what we might do is I'll just give you both the chance to introduce yourself in terms of a little bit of history about where you've come from, why you've finished up in the roles that you've got, and then we're going to get stuck straight into some interesting topics after that. So we might start with Sol first, if that's all right. Sol, if you want to just talk, share where you've come from. How did you finish up being Sol, who has Archie Kids and also is the Learnlife interior architect?
Okay, so hello everybody. Thanks, Stephen. So I was born in Argentina. Saying that, Helen, I love your quote about Dr. Crazy, because for us, taking a coffee and going to a psychology is something that it's really we are all used to do. So coming back, I was born in Argentina, married to the Swedish guy and had twins. And after my degree as an architect, I decided to come to Barcelona because I was completely in love with their architecture, and get a master's degree, blah, blah, blah. And then somehow I started working in different architect studios, but I always have a strong connection and concern about the relationship between kids and architecture and how we could connect that in terms of letting them know what important is the learning environment that we have around. So somehow I start researching on that, and after kind of going around different parts around the world, I finished creating ArchiKids. That is a mix between architecture, design, and how we can spread the knowledge to the small kids. And then there's a point of my life where the dots are combined, and it came this fantastic project that now is Learnlife. And somehow this is how I started working with the entire project since the beginning. It's a really holistic and fantastic experience that we've been through. And yeah, so I want to continue. later.
Right, thank you for that. And Danish, perhaps you could share a bit of your journey and how you finished up being this passionate architect that seems to understand both the positives and the negatives of architecture. And I'm still muted.
How about now? Can you hear me? Wonderful. Well, thanks for having me. Nice to meet everyone. I'm based here in the US. I split my time between San Francisco and Atlanta. To your question, Stephen, you know, I've known since I was a young kid that I wanted to be an architect, probably 12 or 13 years old when I started designing buildings. And even at that age, I was designing buildings to help people. And so for me, I've always had this belief in the power of architecture. I've seen it, I've experienced it. You know, I lived in 10 different homes before before the end of university. And so I'd moved around a lot. You know, by the age of 3, I'd lived in 3 countries. And so, you know, at a very early age, environment played a big role in my life. And I always understood the impact that our surroundings have on us. It's implicit and we don't, it's not always tangible. We don't always grasp it, but it's there and it has a big influence on us. So, you know, I sometimes I facetiously say I could take a couple, and if you let me redesign their house, I could alter their relationship, right? So if I had a couple that was having marital problems maybe, or a family that the parents and the kids weren't, you know, jiving, I could, if they let me sort of go to town on their house and tweak things, I could fundamentally alter that relationship. And so, you know, that is the power of architecture, and you know, it's inescapable. It's everywhere around us. Like you can't, there's not a single day that goes by for anyone where they're not encountering architecture or being influenced by it. So, you know, so much of our lives, like our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviors, it's actually dictated by and influenced by architecture. So whatever city you're in, think about going to work and you're coming home, and if you have to sit in traffic jams, right? How does that make you feel? For a lot of people, when I ask them that, they say anxious, agitated, you know, I feel the hostility rising inside of me. Well, blame an urban planner, right? That was designed. Those are conscious decisions to build your city that way. The same thing when you go into your grocery store, right? Where are the milk and eggs? Typically in the back, right? And so yes, there's utilitarian reasons. They have to cool them so it's easier, but it's also in the back because the grocery stores know that this is a staple. You're going to come here for milk and eggs, you know, once a week, every 2 weeks, and I'm going to make that aisle perpendicular. So as I'm going and grabbing milk and eggs, I'm seeing every other aisle. What does that do? It increases the amount of money that you spend, right? So grocers, which you would never think is this like highly sophisticated designed place, right? Grocery stores have figured out what their objectives are and they're designing for that. So, you know, for the longest time, it seemed odd to me why, you know, we go into these schools that it's almost like they were designed without the objectives, right? They were just, at least here in the US, you go to so many schools that feel like prisons. And so maybe it's that the objectives are actually off kilter, right? Maybe the objectives were not well-being. It wasn't, you know, advancement of the kids. It was really contain and control, right? And so, you know, about 10 years ago, I decided, you know, I want to focus on designing for education. Of course, as an architect, you have your freedom to choose anything you want to design. But for me, education, if you think about all the problems we have in the world, you know, we're very reactive. So if we have environmental catastrophes, we're reacting to that, right? We have issues of race and justice, we're reacting to that. We have issues of water and food, we're reacting to that. To me, education's always been that proactive thing that you can do, where if we just had quality education for everyone in the world, we would reduce the issues. We wouldn't create the issues in the first place. And you know, part of that goes to my definition of education, which is not just that you're learning content, you're book smart, because people have pointed out, well, you could go to the top schools in the world and still not be doing good in the world. You can use your powers for evil. But when I say education, I mean that holistic, you know, that really you're learning sort of how to be a good human, not just content. And so designing for that just to me seemed like the best place to start to make a dent in the world through architecture.
So I might throw the question. I mean, I guess I know the answer to this one immediately because we've talked for a while. But when I asked you what was the key thing that you'd like to share, you came up with that great quote: "The things that are killing us in schools." But what's killing us in schools from a design perspective?
Right. Well, the immediate, everyone's going to think coronavirus. Of course, we've got all these like pesky pathogens that are potentially, threats to our kids. But I think even before the global pandemic, we were already killing kids in schools, at least mentally and emotionally, spiritually. Like we were killing these kids, and I say that having gone through the same school system and feeling like I escaped. I got out in spite of what I was, forced to go through, and not everyone's as fortunate. And so, we've got a couple of things: the lack of personalization, right? I think this pandemic is now forcing educators to see and witness and experience firsthand that these kids don't all have the same home life. Not every kid has fast Wi-Fi. Not every kid has a computer at home. Not every kid has tech-savvy parents. Some kids are working in a house with 6 other siblings yelling and running all over the house, and others have the peace and quiet of their parents' office space to learn from. And so, that inequitable condition that we're witnessing, it's good that we're seeing it now and that educators are realizing it even more so now, but this has been the case always, right? You don't even have to read Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers to realize, like, hey, look, not everyone's coming from the same starting point. And so in schools, yes, we've thought about previously, how do you design for different learning styles, and how do you cater to the auditory learners and the visual learners and the kinesthetic learners? And we've thought about the introverts and extroverts, hopefully, right? I mean, this has been on the radar for a decade plus now. And so hopefully we've been doing this. But just that understanding that, again, not every child is the same, and you're not going to reach every child the same way. Every child needs something different, right? Every school needs something different. This was maybe 7 years ago. I was working with a school actually, down under in Wodonga, sort of in between Sydney and Melbourne there. And we realized that a quarter of the kids were coming to school without having eaten breakfast, right? And so that's a need. How can you expect a child to learn if you haven't designed for their basic needs, right? If we think about Maslow's, like, how is this child ever to reach self-actualization if they don't even have food, shelter, water, right? And so, lack of personalization is one thing that's killing these kids. And then also pedagogy, right? We know there's endless amounts of data that tells us, and our own, not just the empirical evidence, but our own experiential evidence, that getting lectured at for 6, 7, 8 hours a day just doesn't work, right? It doesn't work for everyone. And there's certain groups that are, in fact, more disadvantaged with that learning type, that learning style than others. And so, pedagogically speaking, is, our practices are killing these kids, of like how we're teaching them, even what we're teaching, right? There's no real world relevance to a lot of this. Myself, when I went through school, like I didn't know why I was solving for sine or cosine of, some equation, and I had no idea. But if I were to solve a problem, if someone said, hey, I need you to go solve, river pollution in our town, and in doing that, I learned about civil engineering and, water bodies, and I learned about climate, and I learned, solving some math equations that helped me, design my solution, it's going to stick and it's going to feel a lot better. And so I think the pedagogy component is also, basically killing our kids' brains and their souls, because it's just not fun, right? So now as we go back to school, of course, we need to redesign to be safe, but we also need to think about what's the point of being here, right? So like, yes, we might keep coronavirus at bay and away from our kids, but are we doing justice by even bringing them here for 7, 8 hours a day?
Right, yeah, touching on some very interesting points there. I'm going to switch across to Sol now, I guess picking up from some of the things you've just said. Sol, you will have seen images in the press of the response of some schools around the world to the coronavirus, where they've got X's marked on the floor and people all spaced out. apart from screaming in your head, what do you see as the connection between the design process for you personally, as you think through a space, and wellness and well-being? So that, I guess that question is more than just the current context with the virus. It's more what drives you when you see a space to then connect that space to concepts of well-being.
I think that, as you said, apart from the images that they really inspire fear, and they just inspire a not friendly environment. If you think about every time that I see one of these stickers put on the floor, it just feels like you are coming back to, I don't know, 40 years ago. I think that, that this is a special moment to reflect and to challenge ourselves and to think how can we motivate and create a friendly environment where we are kind of creating a strong community and give the learners word to be part of that community. It's not only about the redesign and rethink of how are we going to make it safe and well-being. It's about how can we make the learners and the teachers be part of that community. We as an architect, we have like a wild overview of how can we transform the spaces into really nice and functional spaces. But we need to have give the people that are using the space the word. It's so important. So as an example, when we start with the project in the Learnlife, we have a great opportunity to involve, to co-design with the learners. And this doesn't mean that they have to do a huge, design. It could be a really small design of a corner of the space that make them feel that they are part of the community and that school is part of their community. For me, that's the important. So if we think to the topic of how do we come back after COVID or whatever, how are we going to ask them what they need, how they feel, what they think about a friendly environment? How can we approach on that? I think that needs to be put on the table.
Okay, that nicely segues into my next question I was going to ask. Danish, you've been involved in some interesting projects which have directly sort of infused well-being and well-being thinking into the projects themselves. Perhaps you want to share one or two of those projects where that bigger perspective on happiness or well-being has actually become a crucial part of the design.
Sure. Yeah, for the last 10 years, Stephen, I've worked with incredible institutions, Khan Academy and their lab school, and Google, Gates Foundation, and just top schools all around the world, and really creative thinkers. And we've designed schools for everything from personalized learning to passion-driven learning and social emotional learning and whole child, and even looking at underserved groups and culturally relevant curriculum. One that really stands out when you ask about wellness, about maybe a few years ago, I designed the Riverbend School in Chennai. It's in India. So it's about an hour south of Chennai, this weekday boarding school. And what's really interesting about this is the school founders are not educators. They were entrepreneurs. They were coming from different backgrounds. So, they didn't have that sort of historical inertia holding them back. They could just blow up anything because they weren't educators, and so they didn't have that necessary that fear, and they hadn't been highly regulated for so many years. And what was incredible about their learning model is they said, look, nowadays with Khan Academy and YouTube and all these online resources, like learning content is easy. So if you think about schools today, why are we still, the top priority is somehow still teaching content? Like that's number one. Number two tends to be skills, right? Maybe we'll think about 21st century skills. And then last is always sort of the social emotional learning, the character of the children, their happiness, their well-being. And so they said, let's flip that, right? Let's actually design a school that focuses on well-being and student happiness. And we want to cultivate good people that are going to go out in the world and do good things. And so let's focus on their wellness. We're going to focus on 21st century skills, and we're going to do it in a model where, it's through the pedagogy, they're going to do passion projects and they're going to sort of dip their toes on many things. And then whenever they find something that they love, they can do a deep dive. And, you know, again, the content, they can get that from us, they can get exposure to it, and they can dive deep online. And so, you know, this, for an architect, this idea of like, how do you design a place to cultivate happiness? Like, how do you use architecture to create happy kids? Well, I just told you, if I can design, you know, a couple's house to change their relationship, then surely I must be able to, you know, make kids happy. So, you know, for us, we did some research and we found the longest study on happiness was done by colleagues of mine at Harvard. It was a longitudinal study. For decades, they tracked people, and they realized that happiness is not a function of your job level of fame, your wealth, any of these things that we traditionally associate with, you know, oh, I think that's going to make me happy, I'm going to chase that. They realized there was actually personal relationships. So personal relationships are the key to happiness, according to the, you know, the seminal study on this. So then it becomes, well, how do you design a campus that's going to, how do you design a school and a campus that's going to foster personal relationships? So there's this incredible research done by anthropologists, and one in particular by Helena Norberg Hodge, where she was studying in India, actually in Ladakh, the area, you know, how in small villages relationships thrive. You know, of course, this world that we live in, you know, it's sort of capitalistic, driven by corporations. It's all this consumerism. It's actually creating isolation. And so she found over decades of study that people living in small villages actually had better relationships. So we knew that, okay, the key to happiness is relationships. So we need to design for relationships. And so we studied villages. We wanted to essentially make a campus that gave kids that feeling of living in a small village. And so, you know, the funny thing is, if you study something long enough, you start to see these patterns. And we found out that there was an urban pattern to how villages grew over time. And that's that in the center, you always have this central square, a communal gathering place where everyone in the village comes together. And then just outside of that is where people work. And then sort of another concentric ring outside of that is where people live and recreate, and out to the outskirts are things like farming and industry. And so we basically transplanted that urban logic, that urban model of planning onto a campus. And so in the center of campus, we have the commons and communal outdoor and indoor gathering spaces and dining spaces. And just outside of that are academics like middle school and high school. And then outside of that are the dormitories where the kids are stayed during the week, as well as, you know, Zen gardens and recreation spaces. And then to the outskirts is farming, where the kids are actually taking care of livestock and growing their own plants and having, you know, farm to table in the school. And so, you know, that was one thing, you know, and taking so much from villages that we got down to the level of, well, you know, all of the buildings were kind of different. It felt like it was sort of aggregated naturally over time. All of the, you know, sidewalks and streets going through the campus were meandering and tight little alleyways, essentially making it not feel master planned, right? So much of what we live in today is very orthogonal, 90-degree angles, straight lines, fastest way from point A to point B. None of it's like forcing you to slow down and smell the roses and actually enjoy your stay, right? And so being very cognizant of things like that. None of our buildings even have corners. None of the classrooms have corners. This idea that like, if you have a corner, then a kid can kind of be lost back there and feel isolated and alone. And so, you know, even little details like that, the housing, the housing was all, you know, 2-story, low housing that had a central courtyard. So we're taking, you know, we're applying this village model at the macro scale, but also the micro scale of every building. So the housing blocks had a central square, and then each wing of the housing block had its own central commons and living rooms where, you know, boys or girls would gather. And so, you know, I think that's a great example, you know, of the Riverbend School, just how it's planned for relationships which lead to happiness. And really thinking about, you know, education is just a means, right? It is not the ends, but very rarely do we question what that ends end is, right? We're just so hell-bent sometimes on, okay, well, the kids have to go through primary and secondary and then go to university and then land a good job, but for what, right? We know that doesn't give you a good life. We know that doesn't bring you happiness. So we actually need to question what that end goal is, that target, and then work backwards to design for that. And so I think that, Stephen, to your question, the Riverbend School is a great example of a school and a design that really does that.
Okay, now we are heading towards the end of our time. I'm going to throw one last question to Sol, just as we get ready for the second input from Luca. Sol, if there's someone who's sort of stuck in the context of their school is opening up again post lockdown, they don't like the concept of the X's on the floor. What would be a bit of practical advice that would help them to find a step forward to know how might they start solving the challenge that's before them? So we're talking perhaps a school administrator or a teacher who's been thrown into this context. What would you say to them?
I think that we have to challenge ourselves. We have to be really creative. We have to think out of the box. We have to think how many spaces around the school that are completely unused and can be used. So why don't we challenge ourselves to commit to convert every single small space around the school in a learning experience? That is my advice. We can just, I give an example from what we have done here. We have a really garbage downstairs place where it was nothing. It was full of garbage, and then we come up with the ideas with the learners. So, okay, what can we do with this little space? And as a starting point, first we go all around the community to ask the learners, what are you willing to have as a space? And they come with the idea that they need to have a solo space, like a cave, where they can be alone and they can concentrate. And then knowing that that was kind of the design that they wanted to have, we create a really small budget. So I think this is not a big issue for anybody. Sometimes it says that, oh no, we can't do it. This is for architects and that. So I'm just giving a really easy example of how can we convert an unused space in something. And if we think on creativity, I'm sure, and if we work as a community, and if we rather look for good communication instead of fear, I'm sure we can find a lot of brilliant ideas. This was just a small example. It didn't take a big amount of budget. And it's one of the small spaces that the learners enjoy. And you know why? Because they did it themselves. They choose that space. And besides all, there's a story behind that. The space, it's called the Yellow Submarine. And every time that we go around the space, people love this because there's involving in the community, communication, and a story. And we have to work on that.
So we've heard that, the big picture from Danish. We've heard that micro example from you there. Thank you both so much for your insight there. We'll keep you both on hold for the Q&A session coming up, but we're going to now watch the second input from Luca, where he goes a bit more sort of down to the grassroots level of thinking through well-being at the heart of a school.
All right, well, let's see how we go. And I think Helen has really framed this quite beautifully. And I think anyone that's listening along, hopefully will see a connection between the ideas. You know, a way forward. I really think there is something about design that we need to think about. You know, nothing really happens by accident, particularly when we're talking about policies, when we're talking about intentions, we're talking about metrics or measurements. We need to think like designers, as educationalists, as leaders. How do we create well-being by design? And in my view, it's really the future of leadership, is this idea of not being a task assigner, not even being a culture maker, but actually being a well-being designer so that people can thrive, because when they feel well, they do well. Why is that the case? Because we are multidimensional beings. I think it's Robert Frost that said, I am legion, I contain multitudes. All of us have multiple identities. We also have multiple aspects of that make us who we are. And so this is, I think, a really great way of thinking about well-being. It's the multidimensional well-being model. And so rather than saying, a person is academic solely or social, we are well when we have the convergence of our physical, social, mental, emotional, and spiritual health converging. And really, we can only thrive or flourish when all of those aspects are doing well. Of course, right now, and it's worth making this point, I have a strong view that physical distancing is not the same as social distancing. I know that some fantastic epidemiologists would have come up with this term social distancing, but I just think it's super dangerous in some ways, right? Because we don't want to socially distance, we want to physically distance, but be as socially connected as possible. Not least of all, because it's one of the largest against stress and trauma and mental health, is how connected do we feel to the people around us right now? And that is the question we should be asking our students, our scholars. It's just the question we should be asking our loved ones at home. How connected do you feel right now? And if the answer is not very, or I miss my friends, and this is what young people are saying right now, as great as we are at delivering great learning, hopefully as teachers, young people are saying they miss the social dynamic of a school. Really the beautiful dynamic environments. It's what make schools such wonderful places to be. I'm not sure, there's 3 T's, I've seen these kind of spoken about, but when we're responding to a pandemic, we really need to triage first, what's the most important thing to do, then transition, and then ultimately think about how we transform through that process. I mean, Stephen, I don't know about you, but if we are unable to reimagine success at this moment in time, concern we never have to do so, because it really provides not just a crisis and not just really quite serious implications for us as societies. It provides potentially the biggest opportunity to throw out, to your point, some of the old systems that no longer serve us. Now, rush back to normal. Which parts do we not want to return to at all? So that's my rant about social distancing and physical distancing. But so what does that mean for us as schools and as systems? Well, I want to start at the big picture again. And this is the OECD Wellbeing Compass. And I love the metaphor of a compass. And Stephen, you and I have spoken about this, but the idea is, great, we can talk about the learning map. We can talk about where young people want to go and they can make their own journey. What if the map is constantly changing? And frankly, who knew that 2020 was going to be like this? It feels like it's gone for 6 years, remarkably. So it really is the idea is, can you as an individual society have knowledge, the attitudes, the values and the skills, and to build out core foundations and transformational or transformative competencies that enable you to really, write your own story. And the piece I really like here is this idea of co-agency. It's not just saying to kids, go and do what you think, or let's do student voice. Yeah, what do you think about this? Well, we're still going to make the decisions because we're the adults. It's the idea of forming true partnerships and really paying attention to the prepositions that we use. Rather than doing school to kids or throwing learning at people, how do we do things not even for, but with? I think that's the deeper kind of question around co-design and co-agency that's emerging, knowing that at the end of this road is well-being for all. So the future of well-being, what is it? In my view, it's social, emotional, and academic. I don't think any of us would really be able to say that we haven't had too much of a focus on the academic outcomes. And that's just because it's easiest to measure. We can look at Bloom's taxonomy, we can look at a whole range of other things. It's easy to measure, just factual surface level knowledge. It's quite difficult to measure and therefore value things like compassion or empathy or, collaborative problem solving, which there has been some really interesting developmental progressions developed for. So I really think this idea of, paying attention to who we are as social and emotional beings alongside the cognitive is something that we should be having those conversations at the school level as often as we can. And I'm sure we can unpack that a bit more in the conversation. So if you haven't noticed by now, I just really like colorful circles placed on top of each other. It's Venn diagrams. I'm a huge fan of them. this is because they show in the simplest way possible how things interrelate and overlap. And here we've got knowledge, what we know and understand. We've got skills, how we use what we know, and we have character, how we behave and engage in the world. And then wrapped around that is this idea of meta-learning. This is called the 4-dimensional model, and it's created by a man called Charles Fidel from the Center for Curriculum Redesign, which is attached to Harvard. I just think this is a really good way to think about the work that we do. How do we support 21st century learners to develop their character, their skills, and their knowledge? Knowing that, mass education school systems really were developed for knowledge primarily and some skill. But of course, that's becoming more and more important to have this holistic 360-degree view. This is also something that we should pay attention to, because a framework or our strategic plans in our schools, they are what we pay attention to. That's really the role of them. And this is the CASEL social and emotional learning model. And they call these the Big Five. This is some wonderful work that's come out of the Collaborative for Academic, Social and Emotional Learning in the United States, based in Chicago. And our colleagues there really have been doing this for 20 years. And so the idea here is, yes, we will be able to do things and to know things, but ultimately, what are the capabilities? What are the social and the emotional capabilities, constructs, terms that we want them also to be able to do? I would say a young person, any of us are successful if we have high levels of self-awareness, self-management, we can responsibly make decisions, and that we have relationship skills and social awareness. And I'll just bring your attention to the idea of those 3 outer circles. You look at the classroom as part of the ecology, and then you can look at the school as also part of the ecology. So classroom, curriculum and instruction, be it intentional instruction, inquiry-based, project-based learning, whatever the case is. Where does social and emotional learning play a role? Where is it seen? How is it actually enabled? Then we've got school-wide practices and policies. And, particularly if you're a school principal, you have some control over those, of course. And then ultimately, how do we connect to the community? Because if we're sending one people at school and we have this amazing piece, but the parents aren't on board with that message, we have a disconnect. And there's some remarkable examples where we have young people basically going home and talking to their parents about some of these skills, quite literally, educating their parents around some of the wonderful skills that matter, things like self-regulation. And at this particular moment in time, of course, having self-regulation and having to study virtually as, someone completing school or someone in high school, that is just a crucial skill. How can you regulate both emotionally and cognitively to ensure that you stay on task and you can be productive, even though, there's constant disruption and uncertainty? And again, I think teachers have just been remarkable at doing this all over the world in terms of just being able to show adaptability. I love Mary Helen Imaldino Yang. She's a neuroscientist from the University of Southern California, if I am not mistaken. And she says it's biologically impossible to learn something if you don't care about it at some level. So this whole idea of, left brain, right brain, all these kinds of things, really the emotional centers and the cognitive centers are totally integrated in the neural architecture of our brains. So this whole be quiet and finish the task doesn't work. We need to be paying attention to how we feel. Because if we feel well, guess what? We think well. Now, the caveat I'd say about that is, actually, that's not always true. If you're just doing a repeatable manual task, that's just the one thing. It kind of doesn't matter how you feel, but as soon as you introduce even some level of creativity or cognition, then all of a sudden, you do need to pay attention to how people feel. And similarly, if you think well, then you learn well. So the last kind of things I'd say, Stephen, is as people are interested in education, in really not just engaging young people, but empowering young people with a compass for them to navigate this constantly changing world, this map around us, a great question we should start with is, what is our graduate profile? What could our young people that are leaving this educational ecosystem, this environment that we work so hard to create, to be safe and healthy and engaging, what could they know, what could they do, and who could they be? And we should have a clearly articulated, really, statement of, this is the graduate profile that we want. We want people to be, young people to be agents of change, or be able to be confident And it's not just about, again, what they know and can do, but it's about who they are. And that's why this is some of my favorite work, the values in action work, that is, it comes out of the VA Institute on Character, for example. And this is strongly related to positive education, which is a fantastic global movement that blends positive psychology and education. Similarly, if we can equip young people with language for them to talk about who they are as human beings, that is crucial in terms of well-being. Because if I judge myself, Stephen, by just what I know, and it turns out I don't know very much about one particular topic, well, then I will be in this cycle where I effectively rate my value based on that alone. But, you know, there's only one Luca Pari, as far as I'm aware, in the world. And, you know, so how do I enable myself to have a sense of value for who I am, not just what I do and what I know, and this sense of kind of doing and being. Okay, last bits. I really think part of this whole conversation, and I think Helen picked it up as well, is growth mindset, fantastic. Individual focus, right? We want a young person to believe they can be better and smarter and persevere and be gritty and all that stuff. But in my view, it doesn't go far enough. And we're seeing some really interesting work. Like, what is kind of the emerging success? We've seen it, again, with policy in New Zealand, seeing it from the OECD. It really is collective well-being. It's the idea of generous mindset. How do I realize that, Stephen, if it's not just you helping me, you know, it's actually that our destinies are intertwined as part of the same human species. So that seems a bit planetary, but that really, I think, is what we're all talking about here. Great. I'm a school leader. I'm going to school tomorrow. What can I use? Here's one of the best resources that's free that I found, that I often refer people to. It's called the Greater Good in Action website, and it's from the Greater Good Science Center at Berkeley, which is in California, in Berkeley, in the Bay Area. And they have some wonderful evidence-based kernels, practices that you can do with your staff, with yourself, and of course with your learners. And they're super practical, really, really key. A lot of them have a social and emotional learning base. Some of them have positive psychology, all the overlays. It's really wonderful. And this is what I want to leave everyone with, which is, in this world of the future, this digital world, the world of pandemics and uncertainty and adaptability and volatility, it's not just what we know. It's not just what we do with what you know. It's who we are. Because we are human beings, not human doings. And our capacity to continue to learn across our lifetime really is the greatest gift that we can give any young person, because it's the greatest asset that they'll take forward from this particular point in time.
Okay. Just get the video working here again. All right. What I loved about that presentation, apart from the ideas, was that Helen, it was just like Luca was talking to us still, even though that was from a video from before going through. It just shows how amazing technology is when we can use it in these different ways, these creative ways. So we'll hopefully Sol and Danish will be joining us now, and Devon has revealed himself, and I don't know whether is the power turned on again in Barcelona, or are you in the darkness?
I don't understand how I have Wi-Fi but no lights. I mean, I'm glad they prioritize, because those are my priorities in order of Wi-Fi then light. But thankfully, it's still light out.
I'm again without light, and I can't put the camera.
Going through, and Danish is here. All right, well, we'll see how we go. Devon is going to lead. He's going to funnel through some of the questions that have been sent through the different social media channels. Some interesting ones there, because I've seen them on the Basecamp. We'll chat through these for the last sort of 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So I have a couple of people have asked about, can teachers be gritty and happy at the same time? Can they be kind of have single-minded passion and take care of their well-being? Has been a theme. And I think to an article I read a while ago by Jeff Duncan Andrade from San Francisco State University, where he talks about if you're working with a community where people are not well,
then finding balance is kind of a ridiculous thing in your life is ridiculous, because your pain should be their pain. You're suffering, they're suffering, because if they were your children, your family members, would you be taking time off? Would you be doing nothing to stop to help increase their well-being? So I'm curious, Helen, what do you think? Where as teachers should we aspire to find balance in our own well-being in the context of such high needs from learners and their families?
Well, it's got to be a high priority. As I shared earlier, we cannot give what we do not have. I love the quote that I was taking copious notes, by the way. I was taking pictures of the slides, so I was glad I was off camera, because that presentation was phenomenal. Anyway, so one of the quotes was around that same thinking, that we can't learn what we really aren't biologically interested in, or at least have some interest. So it's the same on our mental health and wellness. We can't give wellness if we don't have it. So the first thing is it's a priority, and it's got to start at leadership to say that I've got to make sure that at least the people that I manage in the building are well. And that's a part of the DNA of the school. And giving people the liberty and the agency to do that. Even in our mental health model at the site, our clinician would address the teachers and administrators. We could go in and sit down, get on the couch and cry and say, "Woo, I'm having a tough day. I'm going through A, B, C, D, E, F, G." And he would address us. And so that has to be in the DNA, that everyone's wellness is important. Like he said, we're human beings, not human doings. We get so busy doing education. We get so busy doing teaching and doing the work that we forget that we have to be, and we have to be well. So it's got to be a priority. And I love that, the conversation has always been there. It's been in pockets, but now it's coming up to a bubble. I shared with Stephen before in the United States, we deemed the year of 2020 as the year of clear vision. Well, the pandemic has brought on a lot of things clearly to us that we need to address and focus on mental health and wellness like never before. Right when I get off the phone, I'm going to talk to the epidemiologist right away. I said, you guys got to change it from social distancing to physical distancing. You got to do that right away. It's imperative, and I have their ear, and I'm hoping that UC San Diego will be the first to switch from social distancing to physical distancing, because actually I feel socially connected through the technology that we have had opportunities to engage in. So, and I'm not wondering if everyone feels like that. It's shined a lot of inequities on kids who don't have a camera, who have the device that we've provided for them, but they don't have the camera to feel that connection. So we've got some work to do, but it's got to be a priority for the adults in the building. Long answer, sorry.
No, that's great. No, as someone who is working with kids all the time, I appreciate that answer, because yes, I would like to have my own well-being prioritized, because it's true. It's like you said, hurt people, unwell people tend not to be able to foster wellness. But it's interesting too how I think we get trapped into this this paradigm of, well, if they're suffering, then why aren't you doing everything humanly possible? But I think that's a zero-sum game. Well, I can't do. Once I reach my a certain limit, it's diminishing returns,
For sure, and understanding that and being okay with that.
Yeah. One of the other big questions we're getting is based on Luca's presentation on redefinition of success. It's interesting when you think of what success must have been in mind for the people who designed schools at the beginning of the 20th century, right? Basing it on the Prussian army model of education. And so you can see kind of, how form followed function and what their definition of success was, right? Lining kids up, taking a test, getting them out in the trenches. I'm curious, Danish and Sol, from a design perspective, well, first, how are you all defining success? And then how would you reflect that in what you're designing, right? And if you were to take success paradigmatically different than the current definition, what would we see as changes in design in schools and other types of learning spaces?
Danish, all right.
Who wants to start?
Okay,
Danish, or go ahead, Sol.
I can start. I think that taking the quote of Helen said that the eyes is the window of the soul. I think that when somebody came to a space, school or whatever, and you feel the vibe, and you feel that people feel comfortable, and the atmosphere is friendly, for me, that's success. It's not about a really nice, fancy space. It's about making that the people feel home and well-being, and that they feel part of the space. If you feel that, and you can see it because you perceive it in the vibe, then we succeed.
For me, I'd say, again, it goes back to setting the right target. And, as Helen just said, we're so often we're just doing education, but we need to think about why we're doing it in the first place, right? And so, right now, again, like you said, Evan, the sort of Prussian model of just crank them out, assembly line, because they need to just get out into the world and do a particular job that we need them to do. Well, that's no longer the case. And also we've seen clearly that doing it that way and purely focusing on academics just doesn't work, right? So the thing is, you can't heal what you don't reveal, right? And so we need to reveal that this is a problem, right? We need to be comfortable saying, look, education just isn't working. This is a problem. Once we're okay saying that, then it's okay. So what should education, why are we doing it? What should it enable kids to become and do? And so, for me, it's, look, we're on this planet for a limited time. Hopefully everyone's goal is to leave it in a better place than we received it, and eliminate pain for others, live a good life, treat others well, treat the planet well. And if those are our goals, then clearly our current education system doesn't do that, right? We can have incredibly book smart individuals with every credential and initial after their name. That doesn't mean they're going out into the world and making it any better, right? In fact, a lot of times that same education can be used, as a tool for creating destruction and bad decisions and hurting others. And so, clearly just teaching academics is incomplete when we think of education. And so then, we need to think about, okay, are we teaching them the social, emotional things? Are we teaching them sort of how to live ethically and morally, how to be a good human, right? This concept of, instead of just doing, but being, we focus so much on teaching how to do, we never teach how to be and how to be good at that, right? And we just assume that's the role of the parents, or right? But what happens when the parents, where the parents were hurt, right? Or the parents, aren't in that state of mind either. And so, as schools and as civilizations, we need to really, again, to your point earlier, of wrap our arms around these kids and hug them and help nurture them into good individuals. And from a design perspective, it's actually quite linear, right? Again, if you set any target and you say, look, this is the change I want. I'm Starbucks and I want to sell more coffee. Great, I know how to design for that. I'm going to create round tables so no one feels like, there are other seats empty and they're taking up too much space. I want them to feel comfortable staying there. I'm going to put on music and mellow them out, and they're going to stay and buy 4 coffees that day, right? That's easy. So design problems are actually quite linear. It's setting the target that we need to do first and foremost, and set the right target. Otherwise, we're all wasting our time as teachers and designers. And so I think, again, this slowdown, if you want to call it that, has given us an opportunity to really make that transformation.
I just want to say that I'm not going to be a principal or school leader anymore. I'm going to be a designer of well-being. That's my new title. That just encapsulates everything that we should be doing. When you were talking about spaces, Stephen, you've been to E3, and that space was created for well-being. You designed it, actually, you described it actually, Duresh, like you had been there. I don't know if you've been to E3 in San Diego, but from the colors on the wall, to the gathering spaces, to the furniture, to the, the glass, and everything that was designed was for community and for well-being. A space where we can all eat together, gather together, circles, and so we can see and make eye contact, and the types of furniture and the types of, even the flooring, everything was thought out. And it's a wave now where we need to be well-being, not just in architecture, but it should be as school leaders. So I've just changed my title just so you know.
And with your new title as designer of well-being, I'm curious with the teachers working at your disposal. What do you think is not in pre-service and in-service teacher training that has to be so that teachers are prepared to support the wellness of learners?
Everything that we've talked about today. Everything that we've talked about.
So we're getting rid of all the other stuff, the old stuff.
No, you've got to have both.
Okay.
So I think I've shared with many of you my, if I had a perfect world, teacher education would begin at kindergarten. It would begin with people who are feeling that passion. They're teaching their trucks and their dolls and their animals tricks. Those are the people who are going to be teachers. You can spot them pretty early. We would start that at the so that we'd have a little more runway to train in everything that we needed to train. So we create these teacher colleges at kindergarten through 16, on to the PhD level. So yeah, it's everything has got to be there, because you cannot have a 360 approach if we're not training 360. So we need a 360 training approach as well.
Okay, now we could keep talking for hours. We're all on the same track. Perhaps we should be sending the videos of all of these the great thoughts that have come through from all of you and your contributions to the universities and the colleges, and saying this is the agenda you have to follow through. I just want to reiterate for people who are watching this, and some people will be watching this after the event, because there'll be videos up on the Learnlife YouTube channel as well, is that there's a great opportunity for people, again, if they want to follow through. Danish is looking to run a series of workshops around the design process for the things that are killing us, the COVID and pedagogy curriculum, but also, I guess, looking at the individual needs of people who wish to join that particular series. For Helen, she's looking to run a workshop that will actually help people look at the big questions and then take those big questions down to the specific, how do you create that program for your school that is embedded as well. If people want to connect with Sol about the work of Learnlife and what she has done in Barcelona, feel very free to connect through to Learnlife, and Sol will be able to answer questions there. And for people who might wish to share some ideas from Luca and myself, we'll be running a series that looks at, I guess, what does a school have to really throw out in order to bring in a more thorough perspective on wellbeing as well. So I want to thank everyone for their contributions today. It's been really enjoyable dialogue and conversation. I guess we're in a point of history, we're living it, where we hope there are changes that are occurring, and I guess it's wonderful to see the passion of people around the topic of making sure that people's mental health and well-being is number one. So thank you very much.